welcome. Let's start with what you think of the current Israeli reaction to the 7th of October attack.
Well, of course, I'm not here to speak on behalf of the Israeli government. I disagree with the policy. I think one has to understand that the attack on 7th of October came as a surprise, an embarrassment, a colossal failure on the part of the system writ large. This isn't just Netanyahu, his current extreme coalition. This goes far deeper. Both the intelligence failure, the initial response. Now, this has shocked Israeli society. First of all, let's be clear. People under occupation have the right to resist. But that right to resist is within the parameters of international legality, and things that happened on October 7th were outside of those parameters. So this was shocking both because of the failure and because of the nature of the attack, the civilian casualties especially. Israel's response to that attack has, I think it's very clear now, as we are talking, been disproportionate and has consisted very heavily of collectively punishing the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza. Now, just as people under occupation have the right to resist within the parameters of international law, so Israel has the right to defend itself within the parameters of international law. And what the Israeli government has done, I think the evidence is now overwhelming, has gone well beyond the parameters of what is acceptable.
Do you think the Israelis committed war crimes?
And we actually had the chief prosecutor on the border, the chief prosecutor of the ICC on the Rafah border in Egypt, saying what is going on will need to be investigated.
Okay, let me push back a little bit here and play the devil's advocate. And I'm going to be saying some of the Israeli arguments in answer of what you've just said. So one of the arguments is, what would you imagine another country would do in that situation? If the US or the UK were attacked in a similar fashion, would their response not be similar to what Israeli did?
Well, I think the first thing I would say in response to that, Nouran, is I would not keep a people, the Palestinian people, the people who you live among, whose land you have actually usurped. I would not keep them in conditions of dispossession, statelessness, denied the most basic rights and freedoms for day after day, year after year, decade after decade. And I would turn around to Americans and say, if you did this to your neighbors, what would you expect? It doesn't justify. But we cannot imagine that history began at 6 a.m. on the morning of October 7th. So first of all, I would say, you created the conditions. And many of us went around warning people that if Palestinians are denied their freedoms, their rights, are treated under a system of structural violence and inequality, not only of Palestinian organizations and human rights NGOs, but Israeli human rights NGOs and the international blue chip human rights NGOs, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, have called this a system that meets the legal definition of a regime of apartheid. People do not sit and accept this. October 7th happens. Israel has to respond. And here I would say, first of all, your response cannot be thousands of dead Palestinian
So you
children.
consider it disproportionate. What would be a proportionate response?
Well, let's just look at the extent of the disproportionality for a moment. The Save the Children organization has released a finding that the number of Palestinian children killed in the first 3 weeks exceeds the entire number of children killed in conflicts globally in 2022. The average, and it's a horrible set of words to even use, the average number of children killed in conflicts around the world most years is less than the number of Palestinian children killed in. So you tell me, is that proportionate or not? Do you know in Ukraine?
But what would be a proportionate response? Because Israelis say that this happened because Hamas uses civilians as human shields.
Absolutely, and I of course am familiar with these arguments.
How would you respond to that?
So first of all, if you say that the Hamas actions mean that anything you do in Gaza is therefore allowed, is acceptable, then you get exactly where we are today, which is to a place where these kinds of losses happen. So no, you still have responsibility. Now, to understand this question, you also have to ask, wait a minute, why are there 2.3 million people in this tiny strip of land? What's going on here? Why are most of them refugees? Why do most of them live in refugee camps? So again, to understand this, you have to acknowledge history. The history of the displacement, the forced removal, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians during the Nakba.
Daniel, people listening to us now, our Arab viewers, will be a bit surprised because, and I don't have any statistics or polls or anything, but we don't hear similar Israeli voices to yours. Is your voice representative of a big chunk of the Israeli public opinion, would you say?
No, I do not want to mislead you or your viewers. I think it's important for people to understand that the Israeli Jewish population is also a traumatized population. Traumatized by Jewish history, traumatized by the events which led to the declaration of Israel's creation, the Holocaust. I would argue that Israeli political leaders have cynically manipulated that trauma and have turned, and especially we hear it now, the Palestinians into the new Nazis. With all due respect, Nazi Germany had nothing to do with the Palestinian people, the crimes committed against the Jewish people, but it makes people sensitive to these, to shock.
There's a legacy.
There is a legacy. Now, the thing that is conspicuously absent is the ability to humanize the other. And this is not exclusive to the Israeli-Palestinian situation, okay? In conflicts, you have the dehumanization. I don't think what was done to Israelis on October 7th could have been done if Israelis weren't dehumanized in the eyes of the people conducting that attack. I don't think what Israel is doing to the Palestinians today would be possible if Palestinians had not been dehumanized in the eyes of Israelis. I say that because where Israeli public opinion is at is actually you will find many people who will say, no, there's not a military solution. Many people who say there should be a ceasefire in order to first of all deal with the question of the Israelis being held in Gaza, for instance. So there is some openness. But what you don't have is that fundamental acceptance of the humanity of Palestinians. And I fear that this leads Israel to places which are deeply counterproductive to its own security, and it's going to be really hard to reverse that.
And what made the Israeli population more right-leaning? We've seen evidence of that in all the recent elections.
These things are a process. I would argue that, first of all, when a peace process fails, it's more difficult to have a second chance. Then one gets into the question of why did the peace process fail? Was it a just peace process in the first place? Let's park that for a moment. But one of the key explainers for how we got to where we are today and how Israel has gone on this journey further and further to the right is the impunity which Israel is accorded internationally, primarily by America, also by the UK and Europe. Israelis, for many years, were told, you know what, whatever you think of the Palestinians, keeping them forever under these conditions, we can't get away with it. The rest of the world won't allow us. So you had the first Intifada, a largely unarmed uprising. And Israelis saw that there was a cost for maintaining occupation. And the argument for a number of years was the occupation is too costly, the world doesn't accept it. And then something important happened. Rather than America carrying Israel to the finishing line of even just a little two-state, 22%, a Palestinian state on just 22% of the land, rather than playing that role, America, for the last quarter of a century at least, has been the guarantor that there would be no cost or consequence to Israel for the occupation. And so I think one of the main things that empowered the continued drift rightwards and growth of extremism in Israel is that Israelis saw they could get away with it.
This is exactly what I wanted to ask about, because many people are astonished, and I'm asking you here as an expert on U.S. Middle East relations as well. Can you explain why the U.S. seems to be so entrenched in this alliance with Israel? It's offering, unconditional, unlimited support to Israel. Why?
I think there's no single answer that captures everything. I think we have to acknowledge there are different elements to this. The important ones, I would argue, Israel is an ally that played a certain role in a certain geopolitical context, especially during the Cold War, in a part of the world in which the Cold War played out. Back then, Israel has established itself as a significant regional power.
But most other regimes in the Middle East, Arab regimes, are allies of the US as well.
So, to go to the next level, you're absolutely right, Nouran. We first of all have to understand the role of lobbies in American politics. American politics is a very curious thing. They spend billions of dollars on election campaigns. Every 2 years, the entire House of Representatives stands for re-election. Now, most of those seats aren't competitive, but where it's a safe seat for one party or the other, you can sometimes have a primary campaign. I think many of us in the world, Nouran, look and say, how come Americans go to school each day, their kids, and there might be a mass shooting? What's going on here? How is it so easy to get a weapon in America? Why don't they have stricter gun rules? And then you try and explain that. And a big part of the explanation is the role that the National Rifle Association, a very well-funded lobby, plays in American politics. And the same is true, why would I tell this story? The same is true on the Israel question. The role that the Israel lobby plays in American politics. So this is a very important part of it. If I can, one other level, I think there is such a thing as foundational mythologies. And Israel sits very well aligned with the stories America tells about itself. Frontier mentality, pioneering. What does that really mean? America ethnically displaced the indigenous Native American population, and America has prospered on a system of racism. So we shouldn't be so surprised that there is an alignment with a country that also displaced the indigenous population and unfortunately has implemented a system of racism.
So your criticism of the Israeli government goes beyond its reaction to the October 7th attack. You are using words like usurping land, based on apartheid, based on racial racism and things like that. You had an official capacity during the time of Ehud Barak, where you were a political advisor to the office of the prime minister. Did you also voice opinions that went against the mainstream like that? Were the ministers appreciative of your input if it was so critical?
Well, I think I would say two things. Number one, at that time, I think there were more voices who perhaps were willing to acknowledge some of these root causes. And things went spectacularly wrong during that government. And we had the events of the Second Intifada, and we had also the killing of Palestinian Israeli citizens of Israel in October of 2000. But I think there was more of an ability to be reflective. Now, that wasn't across the entirety of the government, but to say I was totally alone would be inaccurate. It was almost a quarter of a century ago. I think Israel has changed since then. But I also want to be honest to you and your viewership. I have changed since then. I believe life is a learning process. I'm a quarter of a century older than I was then. And I have seen things and experienced things, including my time working in an official capacity that led me to explore some of what is going on here. Now, I also want to be clear. This situation is one in which I do not think the Jewish Israeli population go away, that they have no rights. They are there. They are a fact now, on the ground. So we need to come to an arrangement which protects the rights and security and the permanence of the presence of Jewish Israelis and, of course, of the Palestinians. Right now, the inequality is very clearly in one direction. The power asymmetry is in one direction. But anyone who thinks about a Palestinian future of full equality has to, and I think people on the Palestinian side are cognizant of this fact, has to come to terms with what is the permanence of the Israeli Jewish presence. Right now, I'm terrified because we seem to be in a zero-sum place, an us or them. And I'm terrified of what is happening to Palestinians. I'm also terrified of the impact on Jewish Israeli security of what they are doing, because for every hostile, every enemy that is maybe being killed, a new generation of people who have experienced such acute suffering is really undermining the hopes for the future.
How will this current war end, do you think? What will be the scenarios, the most likely ones?
As of when we're speaking, I can paint some scenarios, but I think it is a fool's errand to go too far into the prediction game. I say that because we're still very much in the escalatory phase. Thus far, we have seen most of this outbreak confined to the Palestinian Gaza space, but it is far from clear that it will stay there. We have seen, as of talking, over 120 Palestinians in the West Bank killed. We have seen 1,500 Palestinians in the West Bank detained. We see a climate of real fear and a rhetoric that is extremely dangerous coming from the Israeli side vis-a-vis the Palestinian Arab population inside Israel, 20%. So this could spread. And I haven't even mentioned, of course, whether it spreads regionally, because right now there is a kind of managed escalation on Israel's northern border with Lebanon. What will be the role of Hezbollah? But the longer this goes on in Gaza, the worse it gets. The likelihood of things going much further regionally, the unpredictability increases. America has placed warships and some troops in the region. So without wanting to get doomsday, I think we do not know what the Palestinian expanse or the regional situation will look like. There are plans going around to displace the Palestinian population from Gaza. Palestinians know from their own history that displacement normally means no coming back. Will there be attempts to displace the population in the West Bank? So, if I draw a line under that, my own sense is Palestinians and Israelis will both still be there. There will still be something called the Hamas movement. There will still be a hardline Israeli government, and we will have to find a way of taking this disruptive event, extremely disruptive event, as well as the pain and suffering, and turning that into a more honest effort to address the root causes than we have had in the past.
The Israeli government seems to be in a farther place from where you're talking right now. I'm not sure if you've heard what PM Netanyahu said in his recent speech in Hebrew, where he cited the Bible and he referred to Amalek. People looked Amalek up, and he seems to be referencing biblical texts about killing a group of people, including their infants, sucklings, sheep and camels. What do you think of this rhetoric?
Well, those of us familiar with the biblical story of Amalek, and I watched that press conference in Hebrew, I trembled. I think many of us heard that reference, knew immediately what that reference was referring to. Maybe we comforted ourselves that it was a dog whistle, it was a kind of sign to his right-wing constituency, but that's terrifying language. That's genocidal language right there. In fact, Israel already had this thing called the Dahia Doctrine, which it imposed in Lebanon in 2006, where you destroy civilian neighborhoods. So, it's not me saying, well, we should investigate whether war crimes were committed. I will say this. That leadership was polarizing and unpopular on October 6th. And I think whenever this ends, the morning after, that leadership will have to account for how did we get here. That is one of the things that worries me, because Netanyahu and the people around him, by the way, also the military leadership, are not looking forward to the morning after, which means they may well, for their own interests, not just their own mistaken, I would argue, reading of national interest. For their own interest, they may well seek to expand and extend that. Now, the question is, for a long time, there has been no alternative in Israel. There has been an opposition which talked about judicial reform and ignored the Palestinian question. Is the shock to the system going to, alongside the anger, the desire for revenge, the horrendous rhetoric that we hear, will there also be a counter phenomenon of we cannot go on like this? Either we live here with the people we are among, with Palestinians, in some kind of mutual dignity, or what, do we live by the sword forever? Will that voice emerge? And I'm not saying that it's guaranteed. In fact, it's unlikely, but I would argue it's possible. And what the outside world says also matters. Israel does not operate in a vacuum. We need a Palestinian leadership that can articulate something. We have seen that the head of the PA has been largely absent during this. I'm not saying articulate something where the Palestinians give up everything, but articulate a strategy. And we need an international community, and the West is at fault here, and the West has isolated itself in the way it's responded, who do not indulge the permanent dispossession of Palestinians. And what that probably means is this cannot be an American monopoly. We need other actors to be part of some kind of contact group, some kind of ongoing effort here, because America has proved itself conspicuously incapable, even at a time like this, of stepping up.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you, Nouran.